Galileo Galilei, a sleep story. There is a city in Tuscany where the river bends through the middle of it in a long, unhurried curve, and where the stone buildings along the riverbank have stood for so many centuries that they seem less like things that were built and more like things that grew, that emerged slowly from the earth the way cliffs emerge, by a patient accumulation of time and weather and the settling weight of years. The streets of this city are narrow and cool in the morning, the stone of the buildings still holding the night's cold a little even as the sun climbs above the rooftops, and the sound of water from the river fills the lower parts of the city with a gentle and continuous murmur that is a kind of ground note, a steady undertone beneath all the other sounds of the day. This city is Pisa, and it sits in the flat country of the Arno Valley not far from the sea, close enough that on clear days the air carries a faint salt quality, a hint of the Mediterranean that mingles with the smell of the river and the smell of old stone and the smell of the market stalls in the mornings, and it was here, in a house not far from the cathedral square, in the middle of February of the year 1564, that a child was born who would grow up to change the way the human mind understood its place in the universe. His name was Galileo Galilei, and he was the first child of Vincenzo Galilei and Giulia Armanotti, and the house in Pisa in which he was born was a house full of music, because his father was a musician and a music theorist, a man who played the lute with considerable skill and who thought about music with the systematic rigor of a scientist, who had written treatises on the mathematics of tuning and on the relationship between the tension of a string and the pitch of the note it produced, who was, in other words, a man who believed that the world had an underlying order that could be discovered through careful observation and systematic thought, that the beauty of a musical chord was not a matter of convention or taste but of mathematical relationship, of ratios that held between the frequencies of the notes as surely and as inescapably as the ratios held between the sides of a right triangle. This belief, which Vincenzo held about music, his eldest son would come to hold about everything, about the motion of falling bodies and the swing of a pendulum and the orbit of the planets and the structure of the universe itself, and whether the belief was transmitted from father to son by teaching or by the more mysterious process of heredity or simply by the shared air of a house where thinking carefully about the world was the natural thing to do. It was the most important thing Galileo ever received. The house in Pisa was a modest one, not poor exactly but not prosperous, the house of a family that valued intellectual and artistic life over material comfort, that spent money on books and instruments and the education of its children with a seriousness that sometimes required a careful management of the competing claims of ambition and economy. Vincenzo was not a wealthy man, and the education of 5 children, all of whom he wanted to give the best possible preparation for the world, was a constant preoccupation. But the house was warm, and the evenings were full of the sound of the lute being played and the sound of voices discussing the things that families who love each other and love ideas discuss in the evenings, the small observations of the day and the larger questions that those observations open onto, the way a single noticed thing can lead, if you follow it with the right quality of attention, into a whole landscape of connected questions. Galileo was a child who noticed things, which is the most important thing you can say about the origin of a scientific mind. He noticed the way the lamplight moved when the lamp swung on its chain in the cathedral, and he noticed the way his own pulse kept a different time than the lamp, and from this noticing he derived the principle of the pendulum, the observation that a swinging weight keeps its own time independent of the width of its swing, and this derivation was not yet the systematic experiment that it would later become but was already the essential thing, the movement from observation to question to principle, the movement that was the core of his intellectual life from the beginning. He was perhaps 17 when he made this observation in the cathedral, sitting in the service and watching the hanging lamp sway gently in the air that moved through the great space of the nave, and the watching was not inattention but its opposite, the kind of deep and active attention that finds in the ordinary the extraordinary, that is never bored because the world is never, to such a mind, entirely understood. The cathedral at Pisa was itself a kind of teacher for a child who paid attention to it. The great bronze doors and the carved marble and the painted ceiling and the columns that rose in long rows toward the roof were all expressions of the same impulse that had built the university and the library and the medical school, the impulse of a civilization that believed in the capacity of the human mind to understand and to create, and the space of the cathedral, with its particular quality of light filtered through the high windows and its particular quality of sound, the way voices and music and the movement of air all had a different character in that enormous interior, was itself a kind of experiment in the physics of space and light and sound, an experiment conducted on a grand scale by architects and craftsmen who understood these things in their hands and in their eyes even when they could not describe them in the language of mathematics. The Pisa of Galileo's childhood was a city that had passed its greatest moment of political and commercial power but that retained, in its buildings and its institutions and its particular quality of civic life, the accumulated dignity of a long and serious history. The cathedral and the baptistery and the leaning tower, that famous accident of soft ground and imperfect construction that had become, by the time Galileo grew up beside it, simply one of the familiar shapes of home, stood together in their large and grassy square at the edge of the city, and the child who walked past them on his way to school or to the market or simply in the wandering way of children who have an afternoon free would have had them always in the corner of his awareness, those large and patient stones, the way children have the permanent landmarks of their neighborhood always in the corner of their awareness, not noticing them exactly but knowing they are there, carrying them as a kind of permanent orientation, a set of fixed points around which the smaller movements of daily life arrange themselves. The Arno in Pisa moved with a certain authority, a river that had come a long way and had more to go, and the sound of it was different from the sound of a stream or a canal, a deeper and more continuous sound, a sound that changed with the season and the rainfall in the mountains, that was sometimes a gentle murmur and sometimes a more insistent rushing, a sound that you stopped hearing consciously after a while but that was always there in the background of the days, a constant against which the other sounds of the city played out their rhythms. Galileo would have known this sound in the way you know the sounds of your childhood, not as something you listen to but as something that is simply part of the texture of being where you are, part of what familiar feels like. The evenings in the house in Pisa, with his father's lute music filling the rooms and the family gathered in the warm circle of the lamplight, were evenings that established in Galileo a set of associations between thought and warmth, between inquiry and the intimacy of a household where both were welcomed, that he carried with him through all the years of his adult life and all the various places where that life unfolded. When he was old and confined to Arcetrion, visited by young men who came to learn from him, the conversations in the evenings in the garden there had something of the quality of those Pisan evenings, the same warmth, the same willingness to follow a thought wherever it led, the same mixture of the serious and the pleasurable that his father had modeled in the way he thought about music, as both an art and a science, as both a pleasure and a form of knowledge. The University of Pisa, where Galileo enrolled around the age of 17 in the year 1581, was one of the oldest universities in Europe, a place of ancient reputation where the subjects of the medieval curriculum, philosophy and theology and medicine and law, were taught according to the methods and the texts that had been established for centuries. The dominant intellectual authority was Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher whose works on natural philosophy, on the motion of bodies and the nature of the elements and the structure of the universe, had been absorbed into the curriculum of the European university so completely that to question Aristotle was to question not just a philosopher but a whole system of thought and a whole way of organizing and authorizing knowledge. Galileo sat in the lectures and listened to the Aristotelian doctrines being expounded, and he thought about them with the same quality of active and questioning attention that he had given to the lamp in the cathedral, and he found, with increasing frequency, that what he was being taught did not match what he observed, that the authority of the text and the evidence of his senses were pointing in different directions, and that he was constitutionally unable to prefer the text. He left the university in 1585 without completing his degree, not because he had failed but because the money to continue had run out, because the family finances had reached one of their periodic moments of genuine difficulty, and because Galileo, the eldest son, needed to contribute to the support of the family rather than continue to draw on it. He went home to Florence, where his family had moved some years before, and he began to work as a private tutor in mathematics and as a teacher of the mathematical arts, and in the hours that were his own he continued the investigations that the university had not been able to sustain, working in the tradition of the mathematical practitioners of the 16th century who were transforming the relationship between mathematics and the understanding of the physical world. Florence was a city he knew and loved, a city that in the 1580s was still carrying the energy and the beauty of the Medici century, still full of the paintings and the sculptures and the buildings that the great artists of the previous century had created, and that gave the city its particular quality of being a place where art and thought and civic life were woven together into a single fabric, where the beautiful and the true were understood as aspects of the same thing, where the careful making of a thing and the careful understanding of a thing were both honored as expressions of the deepest human capacity. He walked the streets of Florence and looked at the buildings and visited the workshops of craftsmen and thought about mathematics, and the thinking about mathematics and the looking at the world were not separate activities in his mind but aspects of the same investigation, the investigation of the hidden geometry that governed the behavior of everything, from the trajectory of a cannonball to the tension of a lute string to the orbit of a planet. He obtained, through the patronage of the Marchese Guidobaldo del Monte, a man of genuine scientific culture who recognized in the young Galileo something extraordinary, an appointment to the chair of mathematics at the University of Pisa in 1589. When he was 25 years old. He returned to Pisa as a professor rather than a student, and the return was both a homecoming and a beginning, the beginning of the systematic investigation of the motion of bodies that would occupy him for decades and that would eventually produce a new mechanics, a new understanding of how things move and fall and accelerate and resist. A mechanics that was the foundation on which Newton would later build the grand synthesis of classical physics. The Tower of Pisa, with its famous tilt, stood not far from the university, and the story that Galileo dropped balls of different weights from the top of it to demonstrate that they fell at the same rate, contrary to the Aristotelian doctrine that heavier bodies fall faster than lighter ones, is one of the most famous stories in the history of science, a story whose literal truth is uncertain but whose essential truth is not, because Galileo certainly did experiments of this general kind, certainly did investigate the motion of falling bodies in a way that contradicted what Aristotle had taught and what the university professors were still teaching, and certainly was not shy about pointing this out. The years in Pisa were productive but not entirely comfortable. He was young and confident and occasionally abrasive, a man who knew he was right and who was not always patient about explaining why to people who were not keeping up, a man whose letters and lecture notes from this period have a quality of intellectual impatience, a quality of someone who is moving faster than the people around him and who is not always certain how to slow down enough to bring them along. He made enemies among the older professors, men who had taught Aristotle for decades and who found in this young colleague's systematic dismantling of the doctrine they had built their careers on not just a scientific challenge but a personal one, a challenge to the authority of their whole way of knowing. The visit to Rome in 1611 was a triumphant moment in Galileo's public life, a moment of official recognition from the most important scientific institution associated with the Church, the Collegio Romano, whose astronomers under the leadership of Christopher Clavius had examined the telescopic discoveries with their own instruments and had confirmed them. The confirmation was not merely polite, not merely diplomatic, but genuine, the result of serious independent observation, and it was received by Galileo with the satisfaction of a man who had known all along that the evidence would speak for itself when properly examined, that the question of what was visible in the telescope was not a matter of interpretation but a matter of looking, and that any honest observer with a good enough instrument would see what he had seen. The city of Rome itself was, in 1611, a city in the process of its Baroque transformation, the great building projects of the Counter-Reformation popes reshaping the ancient and medieval city into something at once more magnificent and more propagandistic. The new churches and the new piazzas and the new fountains expressing in stone and water the confident authority of a church that was responding to the challenge of the Reformation by making itself more beautiful and more powerful, and more present in the experience of those who moved through the city. Galileo moved through this city with the eyes of a man who had spent his life thinking about the physics of structures and the mathematics of proportion, who saw in the dome of St. Peter's not just a magnificent object but an engineering achievement of the first order, the solution by Michelangelo and his successors to a structural problem of extraordinary difficulty, the problem of how to span an enormous circular space without the dome collapsing under its own weight. He was received at the Accademia dei Lincei, the Academy of the Lynxes, one of the earliest scientific societies in the world, founded by Federico Sisi in 1603 for the purpose of promoting the investigation of nature by observation and experiment, and he became a member, a recognition that connected him to a community of like-minded investigators throughout Italy and that gave his future publications the added authority of the Lincean imprint. The meetings of the Lincei were meetings in the tradition of the learned conversation, the civilized exchange of observations and ideas in a setting that was both intellectually serious and personally pleasurable, and Galileo, who had always thrived in this kind of intellectual sociality, found in the Lincei a community that suited his nature. He moved to the University of Padua in 1592, appointed to the chair of mathematics there, and the move was one of the best things that happened to him, because Padua was a different kind of place from Pisa, a more open and tolerant university in a city that was part of the Venetian Republic, a republic that had, over centuries, developed a political culture of considerable independence and a correspondingly tolerant attitude toward intellectual heterodoxy. The Venetian Republic was, in the late 16th century, a place where the index of forbidden books had less force than it had elsewhere in Italy, where the traditions of empirical inquiry and practical investigation had deep roots, where the relationship between the university and the workshops of the skilled craftsmen who built the ships and the instruments and the weapons that sustained Venetian power was close and mutually enriching, and where a mathematician who was interested in the practical applications of his science as well as its theoretical foundations could find a very congenial home. Galileo lived in Padua for 18 years, from 1592 to 1610, and these were, by his own later account, the happiest years of his life. He taught mathematics and astronomy and mechanics to students who came from all over Europe, students whose curiosity and whose ability to challenge and to question created in his lectures a quality of intellectual dialogue that suited his temperament exactly. He maintained a workshop in his house where he and skilled craftsmen worked together on the design and construction of instruments for military purposes and for scientific investigation, and the combination of theoretical understanding and practical skill that characterized this workshop was another expression of the fundamental unity of his approach to knowledge, the conviction that thinking about the world and working with the materials of the world were the same activity pursued through different means. The house in Padua was a large and lively place. He never married, but he had 3 children with a Venetian woman named Marina Gamba, 2 daughters, Virginia and Livia, and a son, Vincenzo, named after his father, and the household also included students who boarded with him and the craftsmen who worked in the workshop and a flow of visiting scholars and gentlemen who came to discuss mathematics and philosophy and the new discoveries that were accumulating in the European scientific community. He was a generous host, a man who enjoyed the pleasures of good food and good wine and good company with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of someone for whom pleasure and thought were not opposed but complementary, who saw no contradiction between a passion for Ariosto's poetry and a passion for the motion of falling bodies, who found the same quality of beauty in a well-constructed proof and in a well-made dish of the Paduan cuisine that he learned to prepare with considerable skill. He played the lute, as his father had, and he played it well, and the connection between the mathematical understanding of music that he had absorbed from his father and the mathematical understanding of the physical world that was his own life's work was not incidental but deep, both expressions of the same fundamental conviction that the world was written in the language of mathematics, that beneath the surface of experience lay a structure of number and ratio and proportion that was not imposed on the world by the human mind but was found there, discovered rather than invented, the actual and fundamental nature of things. He would play the lute in the evenings, sometimes alone and sometimes with friends who came to make music, and the sound of the lute in a Paduan evening, the warm plucked notes filling the room and then fading into the silence that was always waiting just beyond them, was a sound that connected him to his father and to his childhood and to the deep tradition of Italian musical culture, a sound that was both particular and universal, both of that room and of something much larger. The sky above Padua in those years was the sky that he began to understand as no one had understood it before, not yet with the telescope, which had not yet come, but with the naked eye and with the accumulated observations of centuries of astronomy that he had absorbed from his reading and from his teaching, and with the developing conviction that the Copernican model of the solar system, the model in which the Earth moved around the Sun rather than the Sun around the Earth, was not just a mathematical convenience but an accurate description of the actual arrangement of things. He had come to this conviction gradually, through the same process that he came to all his convictions, by following the evidence wherever it led without deference to authority or tradition, and by 1597 he was writing in private letters that he had come to accept the Copernican view, though he was not yet ready to say so in public, knowing as he did the reception that such a statement would receive from the Church and from the Aristotelian establishment of the universities. The telescope arrived in his life in the summer of 1609, in the form of news from the Netherlands about a device that used 2 lenses to make distant things appear closer, a device that had been developed by a spectacle maker in Middelburg named Hans Lippershey. Galileo heard about this device in June of that year, understood immediately from the description what the optical principle was, and within a few weeks had built his own version, a version that was quickly better than any that existed, because he understood the mathematics of lenses and could calculate the combination of curvature and distance that would produce the greatest magnification. Within months he had built an instrument with a magnification of approximately 20 times, far superior to anything available elsewhere, and he turned it toward the sky. What he saw in those first nights of observation in the autumn and winter of 1609 changed everything. The moon, which everyone had assumed to be a perfect sphere, a pure celestial body of a kind entirely different from the impure and irregular matter of the earth, turned out to be a landscape, a place of mountains and valleys and plains and craters, a world of rugged topography whose shadows and highlights showed in the telescope with a clarity that made the distinction between celestial and terrestrial matter suddenly and irreversibly absurd. He estimated the heights of the lunar mountains from the lengths of their shadows, applying the same geometry to the moon that a surveyor would apply to a mountain on Earth, and the mountains he found were high, comparable to the Alps, a fact that made the moon a place of genuine physical scale and grandeur. Jupiter revealed its own astonishment. In January of 1610, turning the telescope toward the largest planet in the sky, he noticed for small points of light near it, points that were too orderly in their arrangement to be stars, and over the following nights he watched them move, not randomly but in a pattern that became, as he observed night after night in the cold of the Paduan winter, clearly an orbital pattern, clearly the movement of four small moons circling Jupiter as the moon circled the Earth. For moons of Jupiter, for bodies that did not circle the Earth, for bodies that proved the Earth was not the unique center of all orbital motion in the universe, for bodies that were, in themselves, a small but decisive piece of evidence for the Copernican arrangement of things. He worked through those January nights with the patience and the focus that characterized everything he did, setting up the telescope in the courtyard of the house in the cold night air, adjusting the position of the instrument with careful hands, bringing the image of Jupiter to the center of the field of view, making his sketches by the light of the lamp he had brought out with him, recording the positions of the four small moons with the systematic precision of a man who knows that what he is seeing is important and that the record he is making will matter, that these particular sketches in this particular notebook will be among the most consequential records ever made. The cold of the January nights in Padua was the cold of the Po Valley winter, damp and penetrating, the kind of cold that finds its way through wool and settles into the bones, but he seems not to have been deterred by it, or if he was, the deterrence was temporary, overcome by the pull of what was visible in the eyepiece of the telescope. The moons of Jupiter going about their business of orbiting the great planet with a regularity and a precision that was, in its own way, as beautiful as anything he had seen. The nights of observation in the autumn and winter of 1609 were nights that changed the history of human knowledge, and it is worth dwelling on them for a moment, on the physical experience of what Galileo was doing in those cold Paduan evenings when he set up his telescope in the courtyard and turned it toward the sky. He was alone with the instrument and the eyepiece and the darkness and the sky, alone with what he saw in a way that was genuinely unprecedented, because no human being before him had looked at the night sky through a lens that brought its objects 20 times closer than the naked eye could bring them, had seen the lunar mountains with their long shadows and their estimated heights, had seen the surface of the sun covered with dark spots, had seen the four small points of light beside Jupiter, and watched them night after night in their slow orbital dance. The isolation of those moments is part of what makes them so remarkable, the isolation not of loneliness but of being the only person in the world who is seeing what you are seeing, of standing at a threshold that no one has previously crossed, of holding in the eyepiece of your instrument a view of the universe that will, within a few months, overturn 2,000 years of received doctrine, but that for now, in this cold Paduan courtyard, is simply there, is simply the view, is simply what is actually the case when you look carefully enough and with the right instrument. He made his sketches by lamplight, the small lamp on the stone beside the telescope, drawing what he saw with the precision of a man who had been drawing observations all his life and who knew that the drawing was not a decoration but a form of record, that the shape of a shadow on the lunar surface and the position of a Jovian moon at a particular hour of a particular night were facts that needed to be preserved exactly, that their value was inseparable from their precision. The cold was real, the cold of the Po Valley in winter, a cold that settles in from the mountains and from the Adriatic and that has a damp quality that makes it penetrate more thoroughly than a drier cold of the same temperature would. He would have worked wrapped in his heaviest coat, his breath making a small cloud in front of his face each time he lifted it from the eyepiece to make his notes, the lamp flame moving slightly in the small wind that was always present in the courtyard at night, the city quiet around him, the dogs that roamed the streets occasionally making their presence known in the distance, and overhead the extraordinary sky. The same sky that every human being who had ever lived had looked at, revealing itself for the first time in its actual nature, a nature so different from what had been believed that the person seeing it could not have been entirely certain, in those first nights, that the evidence of his own eyes was to be trusted. But he trusted it. This is perhaps the most essential thing about Galileo. This quality of trusting the evidence of careful observation over the authority of received doctrine, of being willing to say that what he saw was what he saw and that if what he saw contradicted what Aristotle had taught then so much the worse for Aristotle. This was not arrogance but a form of intellectual courage, the courage to follow the evidence wherever it led even when it led away from the consensus of centuries, even when it led toward positions that were going to be uncomfortable, even when the evidence pointed at truths that the world was not yet ready to receive. He published his findings in March of 1610 in a small book he called the Sidereus Nuncius, the Starry Messenger, and the publication was a sensation. One of the most dramatic announcements in the history of science. A book that in a few dozen pages overturned 2,000 years of received astronomical doctrine and demonstrated with the directness and the clarity that were Galileo's characteristic virtues that the sky was not what the ancient authorities had said it was but something much stranger and much richer and much more in need of further investigation. The book sold out immediately and was reprinted and translated and discussed throughout the educated world of Europe, and Galileo, who had been a respected university professor and instrument maker, became overnight one of the most famous men in Europe, a man whose name was associated with the new and astonishing revelations that the telescope was making available. The fame opened doors and also closed them. He was appointed mathematician and philosopher to the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Cosimo II de' Medici, a position that allowed him to return to Florence without the teaching obligations of a university appointment, giving him more time for investigation and more resources for his work, and he moved back to Tuscany in the autumn of 1610. Returning to the landscape of his childhood and his young manhood with the prestige of his discoveries and the telescope that had made them possible. Florence received him with the honor due to a man who had made the Medici court famous throughout Europe, and the relationship with the Medici court was one that Galileo would maintain, through all the vicissitudes of the following decades, with a combination of genuine gratitude and shrewd calculation, understanding that the patronage of powerful men was the mechanism through which the work of a scientist was sustained in the world he inhabited. The years in Florence were years of continuing discovery and deepening investigation, years in which he turned the telescope to Venus and observed its phases, phases that could only be explained if Venus orbited the Sun rather than the Earth, another piece of decisive evidence for the Copernican arrangement. He observed sunspots, imperfections on the surface of the Sun that contradicted the Aristotelian doctrine of the perfect and unchanging nature of the celestial bodies, and he wrote about them in a controversy with a Jesuit astronomer that was conducted with the elaborate courtesy and the sharp underlying edge that characterized the scientific disputes of the period. He continued his work on motion, the work that had begun with the pendulum in the cathedral and the falling bodies in Pisa, and that was slowly assembling itself into the new mechanics, the new understanding of how things moved under the influence of forces. He visited Rome in 1611, welcomed by the Jesuit astronomers of the Collegio Romano who had verified his telescopic discoveries with their own instruments and who accorded him the honor of a learned man whose findings they confirmed even if they were not yet certain what those findings implied. He was received by Cardinal Maffeo Barberini, a man of genuine intellectual culture who was also a poet and who seemed at this first meeting genuinely fond of Galileo and genuinely interested in his work, a fondness and an interest that would, when Barberini became Pope Urban VIII in 1623, create for Galileo both an opportunity and a danger that he would not fully appreciate until it was too late. The trouble that was gathering around Galileo's astronomical views in these years was not yet fully visible to him, or if it was visible he underestimated it, perhaps because the initial reception of the Sidereus Nuncius had been so positive, perhaps because his own confidence in the strength of the evidence led him to assume that others would find it equally compelling. Perhaps simply because the quality of his own intelligence made it genuinely difficult for him to imagine that people who had examined the evidence he had assembled could continue to find the Aristotelian and Ptolemaic system credible. He had a tendency, which those who knew him recognized and which his letters reveal clearly, to regard disagreement as either stupidity or dishonesty, as either the failure to understand or the refusal to admit what one understood, and this tendency, which was understandable in someone who was as confident in his own reasoning as Galileo was and who was as often right as he was not well suited to the navigation of a world in which the institutions of religious authority had a legitimate concern with the implications of his discoveries. The first formal warning came in 1616, when the Congregation of the Index decreed that the Copernican theory was contrary to Scripture and that works defending it were to be prohibited or corrected. Galileo was called to Rome and instructed by Cardinal Bellarmine not to hold or defend the Copernican doctrine, and he returned to Florence under this constraint, which he observed in public while continuing in private to believe what the evidence had convinced him of, and continuing to investigate the evidence further. The election of his old admirer Maffeo Barberini as Pope Urban VIII in 1623 seemed to open a new possibility. Galileo went to Rome and had a series of long conversations with the new pope, conversations that were warm and intellectually engaged in the way that conversations between two intelligent and mutually respectful people are when the subject matter is genuinely interesting to both of them, and Galileo came away from these conversations believing, or choosing to believe, that he had been given sufficient latitude to write about the Copernican and Ptolemaic systems in a comparative way, as long as he was careful to present the matter as a discussion of hypotheses rather than a statement of truth, as long as he included the argument that God's omnipotence meant that any natural arrangement was possible and that human reason alone could not determine which arrangement was the actual one. The writing of the dialogue was an act of sustained intellectual and literary creation that occupied Galileo for years, years during which the book was always present in his mind even when he was not actively writing it, years during which the arguments were being refined and the characters were taking shape and the rhetorical strategy was being worked out in the same way that any large and complex intellectual project is worked out, through a combination of focused effort and the kind of oblique thinking that happens when you are doing other things, when the mind is working on the problem in the background while the conscious attention is elsewhere. He was writing in Italian, not in Latin, and this choice was itself a statement that the argument he was making was not just for the learned but for any educated person, that the evidence of the telescope was not the property of the university but was available to anyone who could see and think, that the question of how the solar system was arranged was not a technical question for specialists but a question about the actual nature of the world in which every human being lived. The Italian of the dialogue is beautiful Italian, the Italian of a man who had grown up reading the great writers and who had absorbed their way of working with the language so thoroughly that his own prose had the ease and the precision of someone for whom the finding of the right word was not an effort but a pleasure. The three characters of the dialogue, Salviati and Sagredo and Simplicio, were not abstractions but personalities, each with a distinct way of thinking and a distinct way of speaking, and the dynamics between them as they worked through the arguments over for imagined days were the dynamics of real intellectual discussion, the give and take of minds that are genuinely engaged with the question and that are not performing a predetermined conclusion but are, or appear to be, actually thinking their way through the evidence. Salviati spoke for the Copernican view with a clarity and a precision that was recognizably Galileo's own intellectual manner, and Simplicio defended the Aristotelian position with arguments that were the actual arguments of the tradition, not straw men but the best case that the received doctrine could make, and the effect of the dialogue was not to ridicule the traditional view but to expose, through the patient working through of the evidence, why the evidence did not support it. He spent the following years writing the book that would become the dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, a long and elaborate work in the form of a conversation between three characters who meet over 4 days to discuss the respective merits of the Ptolemaic and the Copernican arrangements of the solar system. The writing of this book was one of the great sustained intellectual efforts of his life, and the book itself, when it was finally published in 1632, was a masterpiece of Italian prose as well as a decisive argument for the Copernican system, a work in which the evidence of the telescope and the argument of the new mechanics were brought together with a literary skill and a rhetorical power that made it accessible not just to specialists but to any educated reader. The house in Florence where Galileo worked in these years was a house that had settled into the rhythms of his later life, the rhythms of a man who was in his 60s now, whose health was not always reliable, who had developed the eye problems that would eventually lead to his blindness, but whose mind was as active and as exacting as it had ever been, perhaps more so, because the long accumulation of observation and thought that the years had built was now a resource that he could draw on, with a richness that was not available to the younger man. He worked in the mornings, when the light was good and the mind was fresh, sitting at the large table in his study with the papers and the calculations spread before him, writing in the clear and elegant Italian that was his natural medium, the Italian of a man who had grown up reading Ariosto and Dante and who understood that the beauty of a sentence was not separate from the truth it contained but an expression of it, that the form of the thought and the substance of the thought were aspects of the same thing. Virginia and Livia, the two daughters who entered the convent of San Matteo, did so in part because Galileo, as a man who had never married their mother, could not provide them the dowries that would have been necessary for advantageous marriages, and the convent was the available alternative for women of their social position without means. Virginia became Sister Maria Celeste, taking her religious name in honor of the heavens that her father had made his life study, and Livia became Sister Arcangela, and both of them lived out their lives in the convent that was within sight of the house at Arcetri, close enough to the father they had grown up knowing only during visits, since he had sent them to the convent when they were very young. Maria Celeste was the one who developed the deep and remarkable relationship with her father, the relationship whose record in their letters is one of the most touching documents of the period. She was intelligent and practical and deeply fond of him, and she made herself useful to him in every way she could from within the constraints of her religious life, preserving his letters and sending him delicacies that she made in the convent kitchen and managing small practical arrangements on his behalf and, above all, writing to him with the regularity and the warmth of someone who understood that the letters were a lifeline, that for a man who lived the particular kind of internal life that her father lived, the exchange of ideas and the sense of being in communication with someone who understood and cared were as necessary as food and warmth. Her letters have not survived as his have, lost in the chaos of the aftermath of the trial and the years of the confinement, but his letters to her have survived, and from the way he responds to what she has written it is possible to reconstruct something of what she said, something of the quality of her mind and the depth of her care, and what is reconstructed is the image of a woman of real intelligence and real goodness who gave her father, in the difficult last decades of his life, something irreplaceable, the sense of being fully known by another person and fully loved in that knowing. He had, by this period of his life, a profound appreciation for the beauty of the natural world that was inseparable from his scientific understanding of it. He looked at the landscape of Tuscany, the hills and the vineyards and the olive groves that he had known since childhood, and he saw in them not just the beauty that any careful eye would find there but the deeper beauty of the principles that governed them, the way the light fell on the hills in the late afternoon according to the geometry of the sun's position and the angle of the slope and the texture of the vegetation, the way the water moved in the streams according to the laws of motion that he had spent decades working out, the way the birds moved in the air according to the same principles of force and resistance and the management of lift that any projectile obeyed, everything in the landscape an expression of the same deep orderliness that was the ground of all his investigation. The garden of the house in Florence or later in Arcetri was a place he spent time in the afternoons when the writing was done, walking along the paths between the beds of herbs and flowers and the rows of vegetables, moving slowly in the Tuscan afternoon light with the particular slow gait of a man who is thinking as he walks, the body moving at the pace of thought, which is a gentle and unhurried pace, a pace that allows the eye to rest on things without urgency and allows the mind to pursue whatever thread it is following without interruption. He grew grapes in his garden and made his own wine, which he drank with the same informed appreciation that he brought to everything, the understanding that good wine was the product of the same kind of patient and attentive management of natural processes that good science was, the product of careful observation and the willingness to intervene at the right moments and to leave alone at the right moments, the product of a relationship with the natural world that was at once practical and reverential. The publication of the dialogue in 1632 was followed, within a year, by the catastrophe that had been building for most of his adult life, the summons to Rome and the trial before the Inquisition that ended with his forced abjuration of the Copernican doctrine and his condemnation to house arrest for the remainder of his life. He was 69 years old when the sentence was passed, an old man by the standards of the time, an old man who had spent his whole life in the pursuit of truth as he understood it and who was now required, under oath and in public, to declare that he did not believe what the accumulated evidence of a lifetime of observation and thought had convinced him was true. Whether he murmured, as the legend has it, the words Eper Sime Wove, and yet it moves, under his breath as he rose from his knees after the abjuration, we cannot know with certainty. The story is almost certainly apocryphal, a story that the following centuries invented because they needed it to be true, because the human mind requires that extraordinary people behave extraordinarily even in their most constrained moments. What we can say is that the belief did not leave him, that the evidence was not changed by the ceremony, that the earth continued to move around the sun in the same way that the moons of Jupiter continued to move around Jupiter, indifferent to the proceedings of the Inquisition, and that Galileo, confined now to his house in Arcetri on the hillside above Florence, continued to work, continued to think, continued in the years that remained to him to pursue the investigation of the natural world, with the same fundamental quality of attention that had characterized everything he had ever done. Arcetri was a village on the hills south of Florence, and the house to which Galileo was confined was called Illinois Gioiello, the Jewel, a name that might have seemed ironic given the circumstances, but that was in fact an accurate description of the place, a comfortable house set on the slope of the hill with a garden and a view of the Arno Valley below and the city of Florence in the distance, its dome visible on clear days above the rooftops and the towers, and beyond it the further hills of the Apennines, the landscape that he had known all his life, the landscape that was itself a kind of library of the principles he had spent that life exploring. The years at Arcetri were years of continuing work, which is perhaps the most remarkable fact of his later life, the refusal to be stopped by the constraint or the grief or the failing health, the insistence on continuing to investigate and to write and to correspond with the students and colleagues who came to visit and with the many people throughout Europe who wrote to him seeking his opinion and his guidance. He was visited by Milton, the young English poet who came to Italy in 1638 on the kind of educational tour that young men of good family and intellectual ambition undertook in the 17th century, and who visited Galileo in Arcetri and who later, in the great poem that was the work of his own life, put Galileo into it, mentioned the telescope that had opened the heavens and the moon whose face the telescope had revealed, a tribute from one kind of greatness to another. The evening light at Arcetri was different from the evening light in Padua or in the city of Florence below. The hill gave it a height and a distance that the flat city could not offer, a sense of being slightly above the ordinary level of things, slightly detached from the urgency that the city below was full of, and the view from the garden in the evening, with the dome of the cathedral visible in the distance and the hills beyond it and the sky above turning through its colors, was a view that invited the kind of thinking that only a long and uninterrupted view invites, the kind of thinking that requires space and distance, that cannot happen in a room or a street but needs the open air and the sense of scale that only the outdoors provides. Galileo had always been a man who did some of his best thinking outdoors, who found in the walking and the looking at the landscape a quality of mental freedom that the study and the desk, with their particular associations of effort and obligation, did not always provide. The garden at Arcetri was a garden that he had shaped over the years of the confinement, adding here and removing there with the particular care of a man who is making the best of a constrained situation, who is extracting from the available space and the available materials the maximum possible richness of experience, and the garden he created was a place of considerable beauty, the herbs and the flowers and the fruit trees arranged with an eye for the quality of light at different times of day and the movement of the air through the different sections and the way the sounds from the city below and from the convent nearby and from the birds in the trees created a kind of acoustic environment that was, in its own way, as carefully considered as the optical environment of the telescope. He dictated letters in this garden, and discussed problems with his students, and received the visitors who were allowed to come despite the terms of the confinement, and in these conversations the quality of his mind was evident to everyone who encountered it, the same quickness, the same precision, the same willingness to challenge and to be challenged, the same delight in a well-made argument and the same impatience with a poorly made one. The blindness, when it finally came, did not change this quality of the conversation, changed only the mode of the engagement, requiring him to listen more carefully and to formulate his own contributions more precisely in language rather than in the diagrams and the pointing and the visual demonstrations that had always accompanied his thinking when his sight allowed. He worked on what became the discourses and mathematical demonstrations relating to two new sciences, the book that contained the mature formulation of his mechanics, the new understanding of motion and resistance and acceleration that was the foundation of everything that Newton would later build, and this book was written in the same dialogue form as the earlier dialogue, the same 3 characters meeting again over 4 days. But the tone was different now, quieter and more patient, less combative, as if the years and the trial and the confinement had settled something in him, had reduced the noise around the essential work and allowed it to emerge more purely, more completely itself. His daughter Virginia, who had become the nun Maria Celeste at the convent of San Matteo in Arcetri and who was thus close enough to visit him regularly, was a source of great comfort and practical support in these years, managing the correspondence and the household accounts and the 1,000 small practical arrangements of daily life that a man who was increasingly blind and increasingly frail needed to have managed, and doing it with the efficiency and the affection of a person who understood who her father was and what his work meant and who was determined to give that work every protection she could. The letters between them, which have survived, are among the most moving documents in the history of science, a sustained dialogue between a father and a daughter who loved each other deeply and who found in their letters, across the short distance between the house and the convent, a quality of intimacy and honesty and mutual care that sustained them both through years of difficulty. Virginia died in 1634, at the age of 33, and the loss was a blow from which Galileo never entirely recovered, a grief that settled into the deeper grief of the confinement and the declining health and the slow encroachment of the blindness that was taking from him the most essential tool of his life's work, his eyes. He had lived by seeing, had built everything on the primacy of direct observation, had argued all his life for the evidence of the senses as the foundation of knowledge, and now the senses were failing, the evidence was growing dim, the world was becoming a place of shapes and shadows where it had once been a place of such precision and clarity that he could measure the height of a lunar mountain from the length of its shadow. He managed the blindness with the same patient resourcefulness that he had brought to all the other obstacles of his life, dictating to students who came to Arcetri to work with him, continuing to develop ideas in the long conversations that the blindness made more necessary and that had always been, even when he could see perfectly well, a preferred mode of investigation. The dialogue that tested a thought by having it received and questioned and reflected back and refined, the conversation. That was a form of thinking aloud with the added precision that another mind brings. He continued to receive visitors and to write letters, though writing was now difficult, and the letters of his last years have a quality of mind that is undiminished, the same clarity, the same precision, the same willingness to follow an argument wherever it led. The students who came to Arsa in Galileo's last years, Viviani, who would become his first biographer, and Torricelli, who would go on to invent the barometer and make fundamental contributions to the mathematics of infinitesimals, were young men of exceptional ability who understood that they were in the presence of someone whose way of thinking about the world was not just personally remarkable but historically significant, who understood that what they were learning in those conversations in the garden was not just the content of Galileo's discoveries but the method that had made them possible, a method that was itself the great gift he was giving to the future. Viviani, who was in his late teens when he came to Arsa, spent several years in Galileo's household, reading to him and writing for him and discussing with him the problems that continued to occupy his mind. And the care and the devotion with which he performed these services were not the services of an employee or even exactly of a student but of someone who understood that he was in the presence of one of the greatest minds in the history of human thought and who was determined to make himself useful to that mind in whatever way was needed. He would later spend much of his own life working to have Galileo's name and reputation restored, working to have the great monument in Santa Croce built and the collected works published and the full scope of the achievement recognized, and the loyalty he brought to this work was the loyalty of a man who had sat in the garden at Arsa and talked about mathematics in the long afternoons and had understood, from the quality of what he heard, what he had been given. Torricelli came later, in the last year of Galileo's life, and the conversations between them were necessarily brief, but brief enough for Torricelli to absorb the direction of the investigations that Galileo had not been able to complete, to understand the question that remained about the weight of the air and the resistance of the vacuum and the implications of the behavior of fluids under pressure, and to carry these questions forward into his own investigations, eventually producing the first barometer and making the first measurement of atmospheric pressure, a measurement that extended the investigation of the natural world directly from the point where Galileo had left it, and that demonstrated, as vividly as anything could, that the method was more important than any single discovery, that what Galileo had given to science was not just a set of facts about the moon and Jupiter and falling bodies but a way of finding facts that would keep producing new ones for as long as anyone was willing to use it. In the last year of his life he dictated a proposal for using the pendulum, the principle he had observed in the cathedral in Pisa 60 years before, as the basis of a timekeeping device, a clock whose accuracy would be far greater than anything yet available, an accuracy that would be useful not just for the practical purposes of daily life but for the astronomical observations that required the precise measurement of time. He could not see to draw the mechanism, so he described it to his son Vincenzo, who made sketches from the description, and the sketches have survived, and they show a mechanism that is recognizably a pendulum clock, the principle that would be developed by Huygens and others in the following decades and that would transform the measurement of time and with it the whole practice of navigation and astronomy. There is something deeply characteristic in this last project, this return to the principle of the pendulum that had been the beginning of everything, this loop back to the 17-year-old in the cathedral watching the lamp swing and asking the question that would take a lifetime to fully answer. The same question, seen from 60 years further along the path of investigation, had revealed depths that were invisible at the beginning, had opened into the whole landscape of mechanics and astronomy and the nature of time and the movement of the heavens, and was still, at the end, offering more, still suggesting further investigations, still pointing toward questions that had not yet been answered. This is perhaps the most essential characteristic of a genuinely curious mind, that it does not exhaust the world, that the world is always more interesting at the end of a long investigation than it was at the beginning, that understanding is not the closing of questions but the opening of them, not the reduction of mystery but its multiplication into better and more precise and more fruitful forms. He died on the 8th of January, 1642, at the house in Arcetri, with his students Viviani and Torricelli beside him, in the quiet way that a life of great activity and great thought settles, at the end, into the deeper quiet that waits beneath all activity and all thought. He was 77 years old, an old age by the standards of his time, an age that had been sustained by the same force that had sustained everything, the force of the curiosity, the force of the question, the force of the mind's determination to understand what it was looking at, which is a force that does not diminish with age but only becomes more patient, more refined, more exactly directed at the things that matter most. He was buried, at the Pope's insistence, without the ceremony that his admirers wished to give him, without the monument and the eulogy that his students had planned, a burial that was meant as a final expression of the Church's disapproval, and that would remain quietly inadequate until 1637, nearly a century later, when his remains were moved to a grand tomb in the Basilica of Santa Croce in Florence, the Basilica of the Great Florentines, the resting place of Michelangelo and Machiavelli and Dante's cenotaph, the house of the honored dead of the city that had been his home. But before all of that, before the tomb and the honors and the slow reversal of the Church's judgment that would unfold over the following centuries, there were the evenings in Arcetri when the work was done and the visitors had gone and the house was quiet, when Galileo sat in the garden in the last of the afternoon light that he could still, in those earlier years of the confinement, see well enough to appreciate, the light on the hills and the rooftops of Florence in the valley below and the sky above turning through its evening colors, orange and rose and violet and the deep clear blue of the Italian night coming on from the east. He would sit in this light and he would think, not about the matters of the trial or the confinement or the grief but about the things that had always been the substance of his thought, the motion of the planets and the mathematics of the pendulum and the nature of the resistance that air and water offered to the passage of bodies through them, and these thoughts had the quality that all the best thoughts have at the end of a long life of thinking, the quality of old familiarity and continuing freshness, the quality of things known deeply but not exhausted, still capable of surprise. The hills of Tuscany held him, as they had always held him, the landscape that had been the background of every phase of his life, the landscape he had first seen as a child walking to school in Pisa and had seen last as an old man sitting in the garden at Arcetri, the landscape that contained in its valleys and its hilltops and its rivers and its long afternoon light the same physical principles that governed the motions of the planets, the same mathematics that described the swing of the pendulum and the fall of a stone and the orbit of Jupiter's moons. Everything was of a piece. Everything was the same investigation pursued through different instruments and in different places and over the course of a single human life that was, in the end, not long enough to do more than begin the work, to establish that the question was the right question and that the method was the right method and that the world, looked at carefully and honestly and without deference to anything except the evidence of careful observation, was more orderly and more beautiful and more full of wonder than anyone had previously known. Let the mind rest now in that garden at Arcetri, in the quiet of the late afternoon with the light on the Tuscan hills and the sound of a distant bell from the convent where Virginia is and the smell of the garden, the rosemary and the sage and the warm earth of the paths, and the deep and settled quiet of a man who has found what he was looking for, or enough of it to know that what he found was real and that the finding of it was what the life was for. Let the sky be present, the enormous Tuscan sky that was always the ceiling of his thought, that held the moon and Jupiter and Venus and the stars that he had looked at so closely and so long, the sky that was not the unchanging perfection that the ancients had described, but a landscape of its own, a landscape of mountains and chasms and moving bodies and burning gas and distances so vast they required a new mathematics to describe them. A sky that was more interesting and more beautiful and more full of the kinds of truth that mattered than the simpler sky of the received tradition. Let the pendulum be swinging somewhere in the house, or in the cathedral of the memory, the long steady swing of a weight on a cord, keeping its time with the patient precision that had first astonished a 17-year-old watching a lamp, still keeping that time, still regular, still faithful, still indifferent to the width of its arc, still doing what it does because that is what it is, because the laws that govern it are the laws that govern everything, because the universe is not arbitrary, but orderly, not chaotic but mathematical, not closed to human understanding but open to it, open to anyone who is willing to look carefully and honestly and for as long as the looking requires. Let the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky above the garden, first one and then another, and then the slow filling of the sky with the familiar and inexhaustible company of the stars that he had looked at through the telescope and that had looked back at him, in their way, with the indifference of things that are much older and much larger than any single observation, but that are, for all their indifference, available to be known, available to be understood, available to yield their secrets to a mind that approaches them with patience and honesty and the willingness to be surprised by what is actually there rather than what it was expected to be. And let the breath slow now, let the thought settle like the dust that settles in a room when the movement through it has stopped, let each breath be a little quieter than the one before. Let the garden be still around you and the sky above it be filling with stars and the hills of Tuscany be holding their long shapes against the night horizon in the way they have held them for centuries and will hold them for centuries more, patient and unhurried and entirely sufficient. The same hills that have seen the morning come 10,000 times and will see it come 10,000 more, without haste, without urgency, without any requirement except that you be present, that you pay attention, that you allow the beauty of it to be enough. Let the pendulum keep its time in the dark house, the faithful pendulum, the patient keeper of the seconds and the minutes and the hours, each swing equal to the last and equal to the next, the comfort of regularity, the comfort of a world that obeys its own laws faithfully and without exception, the comfort of knowing that the same sun that set behind the Apennines this evening will rise again tomorrow morning over the hills to the east, that the same moons of Jupiter that turned in their orbits tonight will continue turning, that the same mathematics that described their motion when Galileo first watched them will describe it tomorrow and will describe it 1,000 years from now, because the laws of nature do not change and do not tire and do not require anything of us except the willingness to understand them. Breathe in the night air of Tuscany, the air that carries the smell of the herbs in the garden and the distant smell of the olive trees on the hillside and the very faint smell of wood smoke from the house, and let it fill the lungs with the cool and generous darkness of an Italian night, and then breathe it out again slowly, releasing with it the last of the day's considerations, the last of the questions that have been waiting for answers, releasing them back into the night air where they will wait until morning, when the light comes back over the hills and the work begins again and the world is once more full of things worth understanding. The question of what Galileo meant for the history of human thought is a question that has been answered in many ways over the centuries, answered by the scientists who built on his foundations and by the philosophers who analyzed his method and by the historians who traced the consequences of his discoveries and by the ordinary people who have, generation after generation, found in his story something that speaks to questions they are themselves carrying about the relationship between what they are told and what they can see, between authority and evidence, between the received account of things and the actual behavior of the actual world when you examine it carefully and honestly. He has meant different things to different ages, has been invoked in the service of many different arguments, has been simplified and romanticized and complicated and revised, and through all of this the essential fact about him has remained the same, the fact that he looked at the sky through a lens and saw what was actually there, and that he described it honestly, and that the description was true. The Tuscan evening was always his truest element, the long light of the afternoon becoming the warm amber of the early evening, and then the blue that settled over the hills as the sun went behind the Apennines and the first stars began to appear in the east. He had looked at those stars with more care and more precision than anyone before him, had seen in them not the fixed and perfect lights of the ancient sky but individual bodies moving in the gravitational field of the sun, bodies whose distances could be estimated and whose motions could be described mathematically and whose very existence as worlds rather than points of light was a fact that changed everything, that made the universe larger and stranger and more interesting and more beautiful than it had previously been understood to be, and that made the small planet on which he had spent his 77 years a more remarkable place, a place in a universe of extraordinary scale and order, a universe that was not made for human beings but that was, for all its indifference to human affairs, available to human understanding, open to the patient and honest investigation of a mind that was willing to see it as it actually was. Let that mind rest now, in the quiet of the arbitrary evening, the garden still and fragrant in the cooling air, the lamp burning low in the study window, the pendulum keeping its faithful time somewhere in the house, the hills of Tuscany holding their gentle shapes against the darkening sky, the city of Florence in the valley below going about its evening business, and overhead the stars beginning their nightly demonstration of the orderliness of the universe. The same stars that Galileo watched through his telescope and that watched him back with their patient, ancient light, the stars that are still there, still in their orbits, still moving according to the same laws that he worked out in the cold winter nights of Padua more than 400 years ago, laws that hold as firmly today as they did then, as firmly in the farthest galaxy as in the nearest star, laws that are the deepest fact about the universe and the most reliable thing we know about it, the ground on which everything else stands. Let the breath come slowly and go slowly, each one a small and sufficient moment, each one the whole world for the duration of its passage, and then gone, and then the next one, equally whole, equally sufficient, equally and quietly itself. Let the night deepen. Let the stars move. Let the pendulum keep its time. Sleep now, as the stars complete their arc above Tuscany, as the pendulum keeps its faithful time in the dark, as the hills hold their shapes against the night and the city of Florence sleeps in the valley below with its dome and its towers and its great library of human knowledge accumulated over centuries, sleep in the knowledge that the world is orderly and beautiful and available to be known, that the investigation is never finished and this is not a disappointment but a gift, that there is always more to see and more to understand, and that the seeing and the understanding are themselves the purpose, themselves the reward, themselves the whole of what a life spent looking at the world with full attention and full honesty amounts to. Let the lamp in the cathedral be still swinging, the same lamp, the same chain, the same gentle arc measured against the pulse of a 17-year-old who noticed something, who paid attention, who followed the question wherever it led, all the way across a lifetime, all the way to the edge of the sky and back again, all the way to this quiet garden at the end of the day, where the stars are out and the pendulum is swinging and the breath is slow and the world is very beautiful and very large. And the mind, at last, is still.